We now have our final panel and a small change of plan, but that's what good plans are all about. You roll with whatever the mood is of the group. Our new panel is Dougal Gordon, Rachel Mackenzie, Georgie Somerset and Heather Bray. And rather than get them to address the question that you've just addressed, we've changed it slightly. How might this conversation be driven forward by producers? So can I invite those people to come to the front of the room? Okay, panel, whoever wants to start and address that question. There's a microphone there somewhere. Heather starting. Listen in, please, folks.
So my answer to the question of how can producers start to take this conversation forward, my immediate response is, why does it have to be producers? And certainly, why does it have to be producers alone? So my answer to that is enrol others, especially the people who work in the cities and live in the cities and can advocate for you in those communities which you don't normally access or speak to. And Georgie's already given one example of that. And Greg's mentioned the tribes as well. So my response is, how can producers drive it forward? Enrol others, don't go alone.
I think that before I even answer that question, firstly, I feel like I've been a little bit negative, and I think that the red tractor concept is fantastic, and I hope that one day we can actually achieve something like that. But I do think that we need to, we seem to be coming up with a solution when we haven't defined the problem. And I think that we need to work out what we're trying to achieve with this particular conversation to be able to enrol others. And I think that there's specific examples like in the egg industry where it's become clear as to what some of the problems can be, and I think that it is a bit of an example for the rest of us. So I think that we need to engage in a conversation not just about a label, but a conversation about where we want agriculture to be in the next 20 or 30 years, and I think that a label might be part of one of many solutions. And if we can actually get a cross-agriculture conversation, then that would be a pretty big achievement. And then if that leads to a label, well, that'll be an even more impressive achievement. But I think that we need to start engaging outside of the WASP contingent. And the other way I've heard it described it is male, pale and stale. So, we're going to have to start engaging with our women in horticulture networks or our women in agriculture networks. I thought that the ladies in pigs amused me as a group that they had in the UK. Young farmers engaging with people from non-English speaking backgrounds and making sure that we bring a whole range of people to the table to have this conversation. And well done to Cheryl for initiating it.
It's an interesting question. I certainly agree that it's not just producers. For this to work, it's got to have benefit right down the supply chain and right through to the consumers. But I think there's some value in producers driving it. And one of the things I liked about the red tractor model that we heard about this morning was it was largely producer driven, and producers were using that to capture more value for themselves and using it as in some cases as leverage against the big retailers, for example. So that sort of, I think there's some advantages in producers keeping control of the agenda there. The other interesting discussion we had at our table was about, to progress this, would you do it by trying to get the existing organisations together, so the R&D corporations and people running other accreditation schemes? Would you try and get them all together to sort of merge what they've got or pick the best of what they've got, or would you start afresh? And my personal opinion is to go down that first track would just never happen. Right? You'll never get all those existing people to agree to give up what they might already have. That'd be my personal thoughts, is that you might be better off starting with a separate, fresh group with this in mind, and we need some funding, but there's probably options for that as well.
Oh, look, this is a pretty vexed one. There's no simple answers here, particularly when you look at the fragmentation of agriculture, particularly at a agri-political level. I would point out NFF, of course, is going through a restructure at the moment, and there is some good progression there. And certainly they're looking at things like integrity systems to augment that model they've got in place. But in saying that, I certainly have got plenty of history going through the process of trying to get some unification among ag on various topics, and I'm certainly aware of one particular project where we tried to get, I think from memory, about 30 or 40 groups around the table to chip in some funding to have a communication campaign on behalf of agriculture. Great in theory, but when it came to putting some dollars towards it, it just unfortunately fell over, and that's so typical of agriculture, unfortunately. So much potential, but we just can't seem to get unified. However, I agree with Richard. Someone's got to drive it. I think producers are probably in the best position to drive it, but they shouldn't just drive it on their own. And I think that we, however, and agree with Rachel as well, you'd need to do the work before actually starting to collaborate with others. You need to have that clear rationale, do the terms of reference, have the cost-benefit analysis already done, to then go to other parties to explain what's the value of proceeding, and then going from there.
Interesting points. And for someone who's decided to put up or shut up and stand for election to the NFF board, it might be an interesting topic for me on Wednesday if I get elected. But as there's 8 people going for 5 positions and I'm not a WASP, we'll see what happens. I think there's a whole lot of things that producers can do. I don't think we should be doing it in isolation. And I'm a huge fan of collaboration along the whole of the supply chain. And I look at existing organisations, so there is NFF, but there's also the Food and Grocery Council. There's actually the Council of RDCs, the Research and Development Corporations. They already collaborate on a whole lot of things. There's actually some real grunt in the room, and I actually think there's a shift in agriculture towards some more collaboration. It was interesting listening to a report this morning reflecting on the 45,000 farmers who marched on Canberra in 1985, I think it was, when the tax summit was on. And there's some rooms in the head that remember either going to that or, I remember hearing about it. Had some friends who went to it, and I just thought, I think actually there's a tide of wanting to collaborate more at the moment. We just haven't quite worked out how to do it, and we need a framework within which to do it. But the other thing I think that we've done in the last 30 years, since 1985, is that we've abrogated responsibility as producers to organisations. And there's a couple of things there. I mean, organisations want to justify their existence, and so they've said, we've got policy officers, we'll look after that for you. But we've also let that happen as producers. So I can pull out documents my father-in-law wrote in the 80s on how to attract more vocational education students into agriculture for Susan Ryan, who was the education minister. So we've been doing this stuff for a long time, but we've actually let other people do it for us. So I actually, I think there's a couple of things. I think that you actually need to get involved, and if you're not involved in industry and some sort of industry organisation that actually does have a voice at a national level, then that's a challenge. So I think you need to find a pathway to actually create influence, but you actually need to also turn up as producers and work on what is this problem, how are we going to solve it, but how do we have those conversations locally? How do you get involved with, Robbie Bryant's here, I can't see where she's hiding at the moment, but she walked down the street in Maranoa with the Southern Inland Queensland Agforce for the eastern country, promoting agriculture to Roma, because even our local towns and our local children don't understand agriculture and the systems and what we do. The same thing happens in the South Burn. It's about what role can you take locally, what role can you take at the next level? So I think it is up to each of us, and I think it's an ongoing, but I think we also need to try and not duplicate what already exists. So I guess I'm an advocate for trying to collaborate around the existing structures.
Thank you very much, Georgie. I wanted to just add that perhaps a way forward could be to look at the low-hanging fruit, and that's not just because I'm from horticulture. And on our table, we felt that, and I've read a lot of the submissions to the agriculture white paper, and it was very clear that there was an almost universal support for a brand Australia. and that there is a very strong, our table seemed to think that there was a strong need in an international sphere to have a unified brand. So perhaps we start with something like that, where there is a lot of agreement across the table and benefits across all of agriculture and an opportunity to be a united front, and start there, and then perhaps use that as a platform and build the other stuff underneath it. Just a thought.
You know, things get changed. We recently had the International Day of Rural Women. That actually came about because in 1994, the Queensland Rural Women's Network decided to declare a day in June as the Day of Rural Women. No one else had done it. We just put out media releases. Well, I put out media releases saying we were going to do it. So that eventually got taken up nationally, and then it got taken up internationally. So it did occur to me that if England have a week of farmers, you know, why shouldn't we be having an international week of farming? Why don't we collaborate around that? We don't actually have to wait for a brand to do that. We can all get involved. So the concept of having, you know, one of the things I noticed was there was a pack that you could go and do the promotion. We used to do some of that as producers. We actually used to turn up and do those sorts of things, but we have actually let our industry bodies do that for us. So that's what I say, the sort of abrogation of responsibility. I think there are things we could actually be doing. There are barbecue conversations you can have when you're down in Brisbane. I used to spend a lot of time at rowing regattas explaining to women how they could actually buy affordable beef and cook it so that it tasted really good, and explaining what our systems were, because this was a chance to engage with reasonably influential families in Brisbane. You know, so that was an opportunity through boarding schools. It's just the opportunities you get, but you have to make the decision to have those conversations.
Thank you. The comments from the table are a good segue into the next section, and please thank the panel.